Hi everyone, welcome to the Merlin's Magic Workshop. My name is Jeremy and today we continue our series on how to paint Space Marine in simplified non-metallic metal. Just as a reminder, non-metallic metal, or NMM, is a style that consists of representing metallic reflection with standard paint. And I call it a simplified version because we are not going to aim for the most realistic result and we are going to put aside some complex elements like the influence of the environment on the color and the shape of the reflections. In the last video we looked at the blue scheme, like ultramarines, and today we are going to look at the green NMM scheme to obtain something just like that. The approach will be really similar because blue paints and green paints for almost all producers have very similar properties, so the same process will work well in both cases. Quick disclaimer here, this is one way of doing NMM, certainly not the only one and probably not the best one either, so other approaches are totally possible. If you like this kind of videos and if you want to see more, you can like this one, subscribe to the channel and share. And if you want to support me even more, you can check out the Patreon link that will appear right here. And you can also follow my work on Instagram, obviously. Alright, so let's go over the tutorial and I will get back to you at the end for some final comments and additional tips. Enjoy the video and see you just after.
For the first step, we will work on the color scheme. For the middle tones, I will use sea green from Vallejo. For the light tones, well, I couldn't find the right paint to match what I have in mind, but a mix of sea green and off-white will do perfectly fine. And then we will increase the amount of white for the brightest light. On the dark side, I will use heavy green. And I will push it towards the black for the deepest shadows. Like for the blue scheme we saw in the previous video, we don't want to use pure black or pure white on the miniature, so I will take it out of the color palette. So, as last time, I will first show you the detailed workflow on the right leg only, and then I will go quickly over the other parts of the miniature in the rest of the video. I start by applying the base color, a mix of 50% black and 50% heavy green. Then I will lock in the primary reflections with the central color, the sea green. Primary reflections help to determine where the light source is located. Here again, I go for a zenithal lighting, so the source is above and far away from the miniature. So I'm placing the highlights on the top of each section of the leg. For what concerns the shape of the reflections, I'm using a well-known simplification technique that consists of drawing circles for the spherical elements and rectangles for cylindrical elements. It's obviously a very naive approach, but in the context of simplified NMM, that works perfectly well. To apply the paint, I'm using the basic layering technique. I'm applying 2 or 3 thin coats to make sure I get a smooth and uniform layer. One of the most important things to ensure a working non-metallic effect is to build consistent highlight across the different parts of the miniature. The idea is that all the primary reflections of all elements point us towards the same source of light. To ensure this consistency, I draw a sort of line of light from the very top of the leg to the bottom of the foot. Now, still for the primary reflections, I will build up the transitions towards the highlight using a mix of 75% sea green and 25% off-white. I will go over the same areas I painted before, but reducing the size of the reflections. Then I will add more white to the mix and repeat the process, reducing even more the surface to paint. For now, the idea is just to secure a quick and easy transition, like a staircase transition, so I can quickly visualize the global light. I am still using the simple layering technique for the moment, but later we will come back with other techniques in order to smooth out the various transitions. For the next step, I'm gonna continue the staircase gradation, but this time on the dark side. With a mix of 50% sea green and 50% heavy green, I will paint large strips around the reflections I made before. Then, with pure heavy green, I paint even larger strips to connect with the darkest base color. I often suggest this staircase gradation technique, especially for beginners. To me, this is a very effective way to develop basic skills like the dilution of the paint, the loading of the brush, the application and the manipulation of the pigments. All of that will help to unlock other techniques, like the glaze for example, which allows to access further level of painting. And for those who already master the basics, the staircase gradation is actually a nice technique to do fast sketching, in order to quickly establish the light and the colors and to make possible corrections before moving to a more detailed work. Then we move to the secondary reflections. With the thick green, I will draw a line of secondary light on the interior of the leg. I will then build up the light tone by adding off-white. Finally, I will take care of the dark tones using heavy green. Secondary reflections represent the light that comes from the environment of the miniature, mostly from the ground. And that's why those reflections are essentially oriented toward the bottom or the sides of the miniature. But still, I try to maintain the idea of a line of light to ensure their consistency. The secondary reflections are generated by light that already bounced once on the environment before bouncing again on the model. This light is therefore less intense compared to the primary light coming directly from the source. To represent this difference of intensity, I'm not going to push the secondary reflections to the brightest tones of the color scheme. Instead, I use a maximum value of 75% sea green and 25% off-white. Apart from that, I use the same approach as shown previously. The brighter the mix, the smaller the area to paint. On the other hand, the darker the mix, the larger the surface. Next are the tertiary reflections, which come from the light emitted by the primary and secondary reflections already placed on the miniature. Like for the other reflections, I'm gonna introduce off-white for the lights and heavy green for the shadows. The tertiary reflections, in particular by their size, number and intensity, will define the level of reflectivity of the material we are trying to recreate. I draw these reflections in the close surrounding of the light spots I painted earlier, with more or less intensity depending on the brightness of the source that generates those tertiary reflections. Now that all the staircase gradations for all the reflections are in place, we can move to the blending process. The main advantage of the staircase gradation is that all neighboring colors are already close in terms of hue and value, which makes the blending process much easier. To create a smooth transition, I usually go for the fat glaze technique, which corresponds to a paint consistency between the glaze and the layer. The goal is to pull the paint from one zone to another to blur out the transition. But since it's still a semi-transparent consistency, we need to be careful with the direction in which we pull or push the paint. In general, there is much less pigment left at the beginning of the stroke and much more at the end of the movement when we take off the brush. So, if my brush is loaded with the color number 2, for example, better to end the brush stroke in the zone number 2, not to leave any visible marks. The main idea is to pull the pigments by following small diagonals from zone number 1 to zone number 2, having the paint number 2 on the brush. Then, with the brush loaded with the paint number 1, I pull the pigments to zone number 1, but this time following the opposite diagonal to minimize the creation of visible strokes. I will repeat the same process 2 or 3 times until the transition line has almost disappeared. Finally, I will apply a standard glaze, so more diluted than for the fat glaze, over the entire transition. First with the color number 1 towards the zone number 1, and then with color 2 towards the zone number 2. This step is not actually necessary for very little surfaces, but very useful on large transition areas to hide visible brush strokes. I usually start with the light tone transitions, which tends to be more delicate to smooth out. It's probably because our eye is more sensitive to light tones, so it's easier to spot little imperfection and brush strokes. So I take my time to go over all transition lines with the right color and in the 2 directions to the finest results. And after that, I go over the dark tone transitions following the same method. The fat glaze technique might seem tedious at the first look, but once you master the paint dilution and the proper brush movement, it's actually a very fast and satisfying process. Next, we do the lining, very important to redefine the different elements of the miniature and to enhance the non-metallic effect. First, I go over all the edges with the essential color sea green. Then I add a bit of off-white for the edges oriented towards the main source of light. And finally, with the brighter mix, I go one more time over the edges close to the most intense reflections. With the same light mix on the brush, I also add little touches of light to reinforce the primary reflections. And there we are, the NMM green is now finished. Now that we saw the detailed workflow on the right leg, I will go quickly over the other parts of the miniature. But the approach is always the same. First, we lock in the primary, secondary and tertiary reflections by using the staircase gradation technique. Then we smooth out the transition using fat glaze and regular glaze, and we finalize the work with an edge lining in 2 or 3 levels of intensity. With some practice, it becomes more and more easy to determine where to place the reflections without the need to actively think about that every time. It's particularly true for this type of miniature with very simple shapes and simple poses. Therefore, no need to blindly follow the order: primary reflection, then secondaries, then tertiaries. We can paint all of them straight away with the first passage, and then build up the staircase gradation with the correct intensity in the right places. If I had to summarize the role of the different types of reflections, I would say that primary reflections aim to define the location of the main light source. Secondary reflections aim to define the environment of the miniature, and the tertiary reflections help to define the level of reflectivity of the metal. So yes, this is a very simplified view, but as I said in the introduction, the goal here is to establish a simplified interpretation of the metallic effect, not a realistic representation, so we are consistent. I already mentioned some of the advantages of the staircase gradation, especially for beginners. But beyond that, this is also a powerful way to ensure the purity of the different tones that make a transition, especially for very colorful scheme with high contrast going from almost black to almost white. With other techniques like glazes, wet blending or feathering, the risk is to spread too much the black or the white components over the transition, and doing this to sort of contaminate the intermediate tones that are supposed to be colorful. With the staircase gradation, we establish since the beginning all the colors that make the transition in a form that we can consider pure. Then we work on the transition line between two consecutive stages, one at a time, without affecting the actual color of the stages. As you probably guessed, I really like working with the fat glaze technique. For NMM of course, but also for other kind of works. It allows to maintain a high level of control of the paint, like for the regular glaze, but it's more efficient and faster because there is more pigment to work with. So if you are a beginner and you want to try the non-metallic style for the first time, or if you just want to practice more, I really suggest to use Space Marine backpacks. You have flat surfaces, round surfaces, and various shapes that are very interesting to work on. You also have nice little details that are perfect to try edge lining with different brush orientations. It's really a complete element to practice and gain in skills. The green armor is now finished, and so we can move to the other elements of the miniature. First, here's my recipe to make dark NMM steel. For the base, I use heavy charcoal from the extra opaque range of Vallejo. Then I introduce a bit of electric blue to bring blue tones to the shadows. For the middle tones, I add more electric blue. For the highlights, I will incorporate more and more white to the previous mix until I get a sort of light bluish grey. Finally, I smooth out all transition using the fat glaze technique. I used to paint all joints and exhaust vents with this dark metal because it creates a nice contrast with the colorful armor, but this is of course just a matter of choice. Since the armor is green, I will also paint the shoulder pads with the same material to refer to the scheme of the salamanders, which I like very much. As done previously, I make sure to place the highlight in a consistent way with respect to the rest of the miniature. Small disclaimer here, you see me do all the parts in non-metallic style. That's because this is the main topic of this video. But of course, one could try to mix other texture using completely different techniques. I did the exact same thing on the right arm and on the bolter, off camera though, but all details are in the previous video in case you are interested. Then we go to silver NMM, using the same paints as before. I start with a lighter base coat made of heavy charcoal and electric blue. I then add a bit more electric blue again to create blue tints in the shadows. And then I progressively build up the mix with white for the most intense lights. Actually, it's the very same color scheme as for the NMM Steel, just slightly shifted towards the brighter tones. And now let's talk about the non-metallic gold. For the base color I use heavy grey, which has a greenish tint that will be interesting to give an old look to the metal. For the shadows I will use heavy brown, which I will highlight with heavy gold brown to give a warm tone. For the lighter parts I will use pale yellow, which is absolutely fantastic for gold NMM, and then I will mix it with white for the brightest lights. Same recipe as for the previous video, it actually works wonderfully with almost all the color schemes. For the leather material, I don't really have a recipe. I sort of improvise depending on my mood and on the colors that I have around. In this case though, I wanted to avoid brown tones with too much red in it, as it would create too much contrast with the green scheme of the armor. So I went for a light desaturated brown, nothing fancy but still effective. For the optics, I chose to stick with the classic approach, with a bright red to create a complementary contrast with the rest of the miniature. And with that done, the Space Marine is finally finished. We might come back later to add the chapter icon and maybe also some battle damages, but this will be the subject of another video.
Okay, so we have reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It took me between 10 and 11 hours to finish this miniature, a bit more than usual, but I'm not really familiar with the green paint, so I had to take some additional time to work on the paint dilution and also to work on the balance of the colors within the transitions. So we have established a very interesting but also neutral scheme with pure greens slightly desaturated. And with this kind of scheme, you can tint the miniature after it's done to give a slightly different look. For example, if you would like to have more dark and cold green like Dark Angels, you can come back on the miniature with a mix of blue and green inks and go over the secondary and tertiary reflections as well as the shadowed areas. On the other hand, if you would prefer a rich and warm green like Salamanders for example, you can use a mix of green and a little bit of yellow ink and go over the primary reflections. In any case, better to work with very diluted inks to avoid breaking the nice NMM effect that it took so much time to create. We can always apply a second layer if necessary. Alright, thanks for watching until the end. You will find some useful links in the description below. If you have any questions or remarks, please write it in the comment section. I will see you in the next episode, and in the meantime, I wish you a very nice day.